Imagine a small stone room, somewhere in Europe, on a winter night 800 years ago. The windows are covered with heavy cloth. The floor is scattered with straw. A fire burns in the corner, and the smell of rosemary and burning wax hangs in the air like a prayer. On the bed lies a woman. She is 19 years old. She has been in labor for 2 days. Around her stand 5 other women: her mother, her sister, 2 neighbors, and a village midwife, whose hands have delivered more babies than any doctor in the nearest city. There are no men in this room. No priest. No physician. Not even her husband. Because in the medieval world, birth is women's territory, and no man is allowed to cross that threshold until it is over. A candle flickers. The midwife whispers something into the young woman's ear. On the woman's belly, wrapped like a sacred bandage, is a long strip of parchment covered in prayers to a saint who was, according to legend, swallowed by a dragon and burst out alive. And somewhere between the whispered prayers, the herbs on the fire, and the parchment on her skin, this young woman is fighting for 2 lives at once. Because in the medieval world, giving birth was not the beginning of a happy story. It was the most dangerous thing a woman could ever do. Welcome to Medieval Secrets Unlocked. The foundation. Before we open the birthing chamber door, you need to understand something. The idea that medieval women simply laid down in the fields, pushed out babies, and went back to work an hour later is a modern myth. It is nonsense. It is one of the most persistent lies in popular history. The truth is far more complicated, far more terrifying, and, in some ways, far more beautiful. Medieval Europe, roughly from the 5th to the 15th century, was a world without antibiotics, without antiseptics, without safe surgery, without pain relief beyond a few weak herbal drinks, and without any real understanding of what caused infection. A doctor of the 12th century had never heard of a germ. A midwife of the 14th century had never seen a bacterium. The word bacteria did not exist. And yet, in this world, roughly 1 woman out of every 100 who gave birth died as a result. That number sounds small until you realize something else. The average medieval woman did not give birth once. She gave birth 6, 7, 8, sometimes 12 times over her lifetime, which means, according to modern research from historians like Rebecca Pod and the Cambridge Group for the History of Population and Social Structure, the lifetime risk of dying in or shortly after childbirth may have reached roughly 1 woman in every 20. Let that number sit with you. Imagine walking into a room of 20 of your friends, or your sisters, or your daughters. Now, imagine that one of them, statistically, will not survive becoming a mother. That was the reality medieval women lived with every single time they got pregnant. Every single time. And most of them got pregnant many, many times. The child faced worse odds still. Modern historians estimate that roughly 30% of babies born in medieval Europe did not survive their first year of life. Another 20% did not survive to adulthood, which means if a medieval mother gave birth to 5 children, she could realistically expect to bury 2 of them. That was not tragedy. That was Tuesday. And to understand how they lived with that, we have to walk through the door of the birthing chamber. Because everything that happened inside that room was designed to defeat those odds. Everything. The first truth, the room was a fortress. The first thing you need to understand is that the medieval birthing chamber was not a place of neglect. It was the exact opposite. 4 weeks before her due date, a pregnant woman would begin preparing her chamber, especially if she came from a wealthy family. The windows would be sealed. The keyholes would be plugged. The mirrors would be covered. The floor would be swept and freshly strewn with clean rushes or straw. And a fire would be lit and kept burning day and night, no matter the season. Why? Because medieval medicine, which was still built on the teachings of the ancient Greek physician Galen, believed that a woman's body was cold and wet, and that childbirth required heat to succeed. Cold drafts, cold light, and cold air were considered dangerous. But there was something deeper going on. The sealed room was also, symbolically, a return to the womb. The mother was entering a warm, dark, quiet space to bring another warm, dark, quiet space into the world. Historians who study medieval childbirth call this the enclosure. It was ritual, medical, and emotional all at once. Inside the chamber, only women were allowed. This was not oppression. This was privilege. The birthing chamber was one of the few spaces in the entire medieval world where women held complete authority. Not the priest, not the father, not the lord of the manor. The midwife ran the room. The air itself was carefully prepared. Herbs were burned to purify the smell. Rosemary was thought to strengthen the mother. Sage was thought to speed the labor. A cup of warm ale spiced with cinnamon and pepper, called a caudle, might be given to the mother between contractions. And here is a detail most people never learn. In wealthy households, the birthing chamber would sometimes contain a beautifully painted wooden tray or a tapestry showing scenes of previous safe births in the family. A visual promise. A message from the room itself. Other women have survived this. So will you. But warmth, herbs, and beautiful tapestries were not enough. Because the real weapon medieval women brought into the birthing chamber was something far stranger. Something written on the skin of a sheep. The second truth, the belt made of prayers. Somewhere in the British Library in London, there's an object that looks, at first glance, like a long, dirty ribbon. It is roughly 10 feet long, made of parchment, stained, wrinkled, and covered with tiny drawings and Latin writing. It is a birthing girdle, and it was one of the most powerful objects a medieval woman could own. Between the 12th and 16th centuries, especially in England, birthing girdles became almost standard equipment for pregnant women who could afford one. They were long strips of parchment, sometimes made of sheepskin, sometimes made of vellum, covered with prayers, images of saints, and holy words. When labor began, the girdle would be unrolled and wrapped around the mother's belly. The Latin word for this was cingere, which literally means to gird. Now here is where it gets extraordinary. In 2021, researchers using a new non-invasive testing method examined a surviving medieval birth girdle and found actual biological traces on it. Human sweat, vaginal fluids, cervical mucus, even honey and milk, both of which were used medicinally at the time. In other words, the girdle was not just a symbolic object. It had been physically wrapped around the bodies of real women in real labor more than 500 years ago. Many of these girdles invoked Saint Margaret of Antioch, the patron saint of childbirth. According to legend, Margaret had been swallowed by a dragon and burst out of its belly alive. Medieval women found this metaphor obvious and comforting. If Margaret could burst out of a dragon, then a baby could burst out of a womb. Some girdles were connected to real relics, especially the supposed girdle of the Virgin Mary, which was held in various churches across Europe and could sometimes be rented, quite literally rented, by noble families for a labor. To modern ears, this sounds like superstition, and in part it was. But here is the deeper truth. In a world where you had no ultrasound, no epidural, no surgical option, no antibiotic, and a real chance of dying in the next few hours, the girdle gave a woman something no medical instrument could. It gave her the belief that she was not alone, that the saints were with her, that her mother and her grandmother and every woman before her had worn something like this, and many of them had lived. Belief in a room like that could be the difference between panic and survival. But belief alone could not save every mother. And when the labor went wrong, the birthing chamber turned into something much darker. The third truth, the midwife was a surgeon. Modern popular history has been very unfair to medieval midwives. They are often shown as ignorant old women muttering spells. That is a lie. A trained medieval midwife, especially by the 13th and 14th centuries, was one of the most experienced medical practitioners in her entire village or town. She had usually delivered dozens, sometimes hundreds of babies. She knew how to check the position of the child. She knew how to turn a baby that was breech using a technique called version. She knew how to manage a hemorrhage. She knew when to intervene, and, just as importantly, when to leave the mother alone. Some midwives, especially in cities like Paris, London, and Nuremberg, were licensed by the local authorities. In 15th century Germany, midwives had to be examined by town councils before they were allowed to practice. In France, they took oaths swearing to help rich and poor women equally. And a great deal of what they knew came from women for women. In the 12th century, at the famous medical school of Salerno in southern Italy, one of the only medical schools in Europe that admitted women, a group of medical texts were produced known as the Trotula. These texts covered pregnancy, labor, complications, postnatal care, and even discussions of infertility. They were copied, translated, and used across Europe for centuries. When labor went well, the midwife's job was to keep the room calm, warm, and safe. When it went wrong, her job became something else entirely. If the baby was in the wrong position, the midwife might try to turn it manually. If the labor stalled, she might use herbs like pennyroyal or ergot to try to strengthen the contractions, sometimes with terrifying consequences. If the mother was bleeding heavily, the midwife would pack the wound with linen. If the mother died and the baby was still moving, the midwife had one final, terrible duty. She had to cut the child out. Medieval cesarean sections were performed, but almost always on a dying or already dead mother. The procedure came from an ancient Roman law, later called the Lex Regia, which forbade burying a pregnant woman with her child still inside her. If the mother died in labor, the baby had to be removed. Sometimes, in rare cases, the child was pulled out alive. Records of a cesarean where both mother and child survived do not appear reliably in Europe until 1500 in Switzerland, when a pig gelder named Jacob Neufer is said to have operated on his own wife, and she lived. Whether the story is fully true is disputed, but for centuries before that, the cesarean was, in almost every recorded case, the last act of a tragedy. But even a mother who survived the birth was not safe, because the greatest killer was still waiting for her, waiting 3 days later. The fourth truth, the fever that could not be seen. You have just given birth. You survived. The baby is alive and crying. Your mother is holding your hand. You are exhausted but happy. And for 2 full days, you feel like you might actually recover. Then, on the 3rd day, you start to feel warm. You do not think much of it. The fire is close. The room is stuffy. But by the evening, you cannot stop shivering. By the next morning, your body is burning. Your abdomen aches in a way that is not the normal ache of birth. And within a week, in far too many cases, you are dead. This is childbed fever. In medical terms, puerperal sepsis. It was the invisible killer that stalked medieval mothers, and it was almost impossible to stop because nobody in the medieval world understood that hands, sheets, and instruments could carry death. The disease was caused, in most cases, by bacterial infection of the uterus, often from unwashed hands or unclean tools reaching inside the mother during or after delivery. It killed strong, healthy young women days after what appeared to be a successful birth. It killed queens. It killed peasants. It killed nuns who had never wanted children in the first place. It did not care. Perhaps the most famous case in later medieval history is Jane Seymour, the 3rd wife of King Henry VIII of England. She gave birth to a healthy son, the future King Edward VI, on the 12th of October 1537. The kingdom celebrated. Bonfires were lit. Church bells rang across London. Henry VIII finally had his male heir. 12 days later, Jane Seymour was dead, almost certainly of puerperal fever. If a queen of England, with the best physicians in the country at her bedside, could die 12 days after a successful birth, imagine the odds facing an ordinary peasant woman in a village with no doctor at all. The truth is that we did not truly beat childbed fever until the middle of the 19th century, when a Hungarian doctor named Ignaz Semmelweis realized that doctors going straight from autopsy rooms to delivery rooms without washing their hands were killing their own patients. He was mocked, ignored, and eventually driven into a mental asylum for insisting on hand washing. He died in 1865, long after the medieval world had ended and long before his ideas were accepted. So for every century of the medieval period, The third day after birth was a day mothers feared as much as the labor itself. But not every horror of medieval childbirth happened to the mother. Some were reserved for the child. The fifth truth: the child who had to be baptized fast. The moment a medieval baby was born, a race began. Not a race for medical treatment, a race for the child's soul. In medieval Christian belief, an unbaptized baby who died could not enter heaven. Instead, theologians debated whether such a child went to a place called limbo, a shadowy borderland at the edge of the afterlife, forever separated from God. To a medieval mother, this was not an abstract theological question. This was the difference between seeing her child in the next world or losing them forever. So the moment a baby was born, especially one who looked weak, the midwife was legally and religiously allowed to perform an emergency baptism on the spot. She would pour water on the child's head and speak the sacred words. If she used the correct formula, the baptism was valid. The child's soul was safe, even if the little body died an hour later. Because of this, midwives were sometimes examined by priests to make sure they knew the exact Latin words. In some regions, midwives had to swear an oath before a bishop that they knew how to baptize correctly. If the baby survived past the first hour, a formal baptism at the parish church was usually scheduled within a few days. Which brings us to another surprising fact. In most of medieval Europe, the mother was not present at her own child's baptism. Why? Because she was still considered ritually unclean. For roughly 4 to 6 weeks after giving birth, medieval mothers observed what was called the churching. Based on old Jewish and early Christian traditions, and drawn from the book of Leviticus, the church taught that a mother needed a period of purification before returning to public religious life. During this time, in theory, she stayed home. She rested. She recovered. The churching ceremony itself, when the mother finally returned to church, was a real, joyful community event. She would be met at the church door by the priest, blessed, and welcomed back inside. In some regions, other women in the parish would gather to accompany her. It was, in effect, a public celebration of her survival. Now, historians debate how much of this was actually oppressive and how much was, in a strange way, protective. Because those 4 to 6 weeks of enforced rest, in a world where women normally worked from dawn to dusk, may have saved thousands of lives. It gave the mother time to heal, to breastfeed, and to bond with her baby. And the way that baby was cared for is where the story becomes strangest of all. The sixth truth: the child bound like a little prisoner. Look at any medieval painting of a newborn baby from the 12th century all the way through the 15th, and you will notice something odd. The baby is not naked. The baby is not in a soft blanket. The baby is wrapped up from neck to feet in tight linen bands, with the arms pinned to the sides and the legs held straight. It looks less like a modern baby and more like a tiny mummy. This is swaddling. And it was not a strange local custom. It was universal across medieval Europe. Medieval caregivers, drawing on ancient Greek and Roman medical writers, believed that a newborn's body was dangerously soft. If left free, they thought, the child's limbs might grow crooked. The spine might twist. The child might not develop properly. Tight swaddling, they believed, forced the body to grow straight. So immediately after birth, the baby would be bathed, sometimes rubbed with salt or wine to toughen the skin, sometimes anointed with oils, and then wrapped tightly in linen strips. The wrapping was often changed only 2 or 3 times a day, which by modern standards sounds terrible, but which by medieval standards was considered thorough care. Modern archaeological research on medieval infant skeletons has actually found evidence that heavy swaddling may have affected bone development in some children. So the practice was not just uncomfortable. In extreme cases, it might have caused real harm. But swaddling also served another purpose. A swaddled baby was easier to carry, easier to hang from a peg on the wall while the mother worked, easier to place in a cradle without worrying about it rolling out. In a world of open fires, sharp tools, and animals wandering through the house, a tightly wrapped baby was in some grim way a safer baby, And then there is the question of who fed the child. In wealthy families, especially among the nobility, mothers usually did not breastfeed their own babies. Instead, they hired wet nurses, other women who had recently given birth and could nurse the noble child alongside their own. This was so common that in some regions, contracts survived that specify what the wet nurse was allowed to eat, what she was forbidden to drink, and how many hours she was expected to sleep. In late medieval Castile, in Spain, a wet nurse whose infant charge died in her care could even be charged with negligence, and in some cases, with murder. Ordinary mothers, however, breastfed their own children, often for 2 years or more. And here is the quiet truth that survives all the horror. Medieval mothers loved their children. Fiercely. Passionately. Desperately. Every chronicle, every letter, every miracle story of a saint healing a sick child tells us the same thing. The love did not change. Only the odds did. The philosophical synthesis. So what do we do with all of this? We're used to thinking of childbirth as one of the most safely medicalized events in the modern world. In most Western countries today, the maternal mortality rate is somewhere between 5 and 20 deaths per 100,000 births. In the Middle Ages, it may have been 100 to 150 per 10,000. That is roughly 100 times higher. And yet, the medieval world did not respond to those odds with despair. It responded with ritual, with community, with whispered prayers and painted trays and belts made of parchment. It responded with a room full of women, holding each other's hands in the dark, refusing to let each other die alone. There is something in that response that our own century has quietly lost. Modern childbirth is safer than it has ever been. That is a miracle worth celebrating. But it is also, for many women, lonelier than it has ever been. Fluorescent lights, strangers in scrubs, beeping machines, no mother in the room, no sister, no neighbor, no one whose hands have done this 100 times before. The medieval birthing chamber was a dangerous place, but it was not a lonely one. And here is the deeper lesson. Fear does not go away when the risk goes away. Fear is baked into the act of bringing new life into a world you cannot fully protect it from. Medieval women knew this. They stared it in the face, and they surrounded it with candles and prayers and each other. If we can hold on to any part of that in our modern hospitals, we should, because a mother in labor is doing something ancient, something older than medicine, something older than religion, something older than language. She is, quite literally, on the frontier between two worlds, and she should not have to cross it alone. The final truth in CTA. If you have made it this far, thank you. Truly. You have just walked through 800 years of one of the most misunderstood chapters in human history. The point of this video is not to horrify you with statistics. The point is to make you look at every medieval mother, every noblewoman on a tapestry, every peasant girl in a manuscript, and see her differently. She was not a background figure. She was a woman who had faced down a life-threatening event, probably many times, in a world that could not save her if things went wrong. And she did it anyway, again and again, because she wanted her children more than she feared what it might cost her. Every one of us alive today is descended from women who survived those rooms. Every single one. If this journey moved you, if it changed how you see the past, even a little, do us one small favor. Subscribe to Medieval Secrets Unlocked. Every subscriber helps us pull back the curtain on the stories the school books were too polite to tell. And in the comments below, we want to hear from you. Of everything you just learned, what surprised you most? The parchment girdles wrapped around mothers in labor? The queen who died 12 days after giving birth to a future king? The midwives who could perform emergency baptisms in Latin? Or the simple, staggering statistic that one medieval woman in 20 did not survive becoming a mother? Tell us. Because these women's stories deserve to be spoken out loud. Ring the bell for the next video. Share this one with someone who needs to see medieval women differently. And remember one simple thing. Every civilization stands on the courage of its mothers. and medieval Europe was no exception. Historical note. This video is based on documented medieval chronicles, medical texts, including the 12th century Trotula Compendium from Salerno, modern academic research by historians including Monica H. Green, Rebecca Pod, and Catherine Storm Hindley, and recent archaeological and biomolecular studies of surviving birthing girdles and medieval infant remains. Some numbers, especially mortality estimates, are debated among historians and are noted where relevant. This story is shared with respect for the women who lived it, not to sensationalize their suffering. History remembered honestly is history that honors them properly.